Dead Air, written by Jonathan Dunne, narrated for you by the author. Ghost Gun. "So," wheezed the old man, "you're turning 18 today." He paused for thought. "Never thought I'd be around to say that, Petey." These words were more for his benefit than for his grandson. "Yep, I'm a man." Pete Devereaux's proud smile faltered as his eyes strayed from his ailing grandfather to the pistol in the lit case on the wall above the old man's sofa, which had become his bed and was soon to become his deathbed. Pete refused to talk about that. Old Jake Devereaux, however, wallowed in the morbid subject. It was the old man's way of preparing himself, getting out there and making little of it when, in reality, the prospect of death absolutely terrified him right through to his old bones. They had enjoyed a pleasant Friday evening together, exchanging stories about their lives, not that there was much left to say, considering Pete Devereaux was visiting his grandfather every week, every day, since the not-so-surprising diagnosis. The old man liked his grandson's school stories, never tired of Pete's fresh escapades, sabotaging chemistry experiments or smuggling a wild sparrow or two into the classroom and setting them free in the middle of maths class. No birds were ever harmed during these chaotic and hilarious forays into the absurd. Old Jake Devereaux truly enjoyed his grandson's imitation of Mr. Edmund's reaction to the fluttering birds. "Everyone, keep calm. Just keep calm." While Pete, in the guise of Edmunds, who the old man knew, was on the brink of a panic attack, having a fear of winged creatures and feathers. It was Pete's facial gestures that cracked him up. The lad was a tearaway, and the old man shouldn't encourage him, but he could see Pete was leaving his childhood behind him, and his bird-smuggling days would soon be just a memory. Then it would be all about fitting into society and getting real, as they say. Jake saw himself in Pete, in ways that frightened him sometimes. He was just like him when he was his age, until the war quietened him. If spirits or souls were hereditary, then Jake Devereaux was sure he would hand his down to Pete, if he hadn't done so already. "How about you tell me one of your war stories, Grandad?" And just like the old man enjoyed the young man's antics, Pete enjoyed his grandfather's stories of past glories on the hot, sandy battlefield. His hair-raising tales never grew old, unlike the storyteller of those stories, who had grown very old in just a few goddamn weeks. After everything Pete's grandfather had been through in the Lebanese war, dismantling undetonated grenades hidden in the sand, dodging the whizzing bullets. But there was one bullet the old man hadn't dodged, and it was the slowest bullet of all. Permeating all of this was a silent killer, and Jake Devereaux's eyes wandered from the metal case to the lit velvet flare cigarette that wasn't in the desert, but here in this unassuming bungalow. Petey stared at the bluish tendril of smoke rising from the cancer stick, the real killer here. The silent killer that had been chipping away at his grandfather, killing him softly. But the phlegmy hack from the old man was anything but soft. Petey flinched with every whooping cough that shook the old man's frame in his makeshift bed. "Grandad, you shouldn't be smoking. It's going to kill you." "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," came wheezy Jake's answer. "That's bullshit, and you know it." Pete was desperate. His father had told him not to let his old man near a pack of cigarettes. How can they be allowed to do this? He glanced at the forever burning cigarette lodged between the old man's stained fingers. "The doctors told you to give up smoking." "The horse has bolted, son." Pete wasn't sure what he meant by that, but his tone was one of dismissal. "Smoking should be banned. A heavy fine to anyone caught inhaling smoke into their lungs," commented Pete, holding back the real terror and desperation as the old man withered away before him. "Putting smoke in your lungs? Grandad, that's the last place where smoke should be." Jake huffed a phlegmy cackle At least I got 2 of 'em. It's not funny, Grandad. Haven't you seen the signs on the cigarette packet? Pete grabbed the box of 20 velvet flare on the sofa armrest and held it up in front of the old man. Smoking kills is clearly written on the packet, yet cigarettes are sold by the millions and killing... Pete googled the statistics. The Who says, "Great band," wheezed the old man. I remember when Pete Townsend... Not that Who, Grandad. Come on, you got to take this seriously. The Who, as in the World Health Organization. It says here that smoking kills 8 million people per year and another 1.3 million people die due to secondary smoke inhalation. Pete thought about all those hours he'd spent in this little bungalow, inhaling his grandfather's cigarette smoke. That's got to be wrong. Why isn't anyone being held responsible for this genocide? Genocide? I've seen genocide. Deaths due to smoking aren't genocide. Nobody's killing anyone on purpose. The cigarette companies are, Grandad. They've got blood on their hands, and guess what? You're paying for them to kill you. The old man hadn't thought about it that way. I wish you'd taught me that 60 years ago, when I thought I was a hard man. Pete considered himself to be a hard man, but the welling tears whispering to him now told him he wasn't all that tough. He needed to change the subject fast. If he didn't, he was going to run screaming from the house. The young man felt hopeless, in the knowing that his grandfather was even more hopeless. The old man's war story about being kidnapped by sand pirates was riveting, but Pete's grandfather became a hostage the minute he stuck his first cigarette between his lips and sparked up. Smoking was a real kidnapper here. Jake would have been about the same age as Pete is now, and that was a shocking notion for the lad who had just turned 18. Today, in fact. The only good thing I can take from this, lad, is the knowing that you will never put a cancer stick between your lips, 'cause you've seen his destruction. That's a life lesson. The old man hitched to catch his breath. He was breathing dead air. Switch on the machine. Jake Devereaux pulled on his breathing mask over his nose and mouth while Pete switched on the ventilator. He had grown to hate that sound. Pete wanted to take the smouldering cigarette and stamp the butt out on his grandfather's forehead for being such a fucking idiot. You need to channel that anger. Channel it by changing the subject. The horse has bolted, Petey. Give me a war story, please. Nope. Oh, come on, Grandad. I'm not proud of those stories, Petey. War isn't something to be proud of. Besides, I've told you every story I ever had about the war. If it's the one where we were trapped behind the sand dune, then you haven't told me every story. An unexpected lull descended in the room as Pete Devereaux considered his frail grandfather behind the cloud of bluish smoke rising from his burning cigarette. They both knew which story remained untold. It hung over them right now, and had been hanging over them for years, literally. The young man's line of vision strayed upwards to one of 2 lit cases on the wall. Jake Devereaux's roomy eyeballs followed Petey's to the case nearest to them, above the old man's sofa that had become his bed over the last 3 months, and in the not-so-distant future, his deathbed. They considered the case with the enshrined pistol. Pete broke the tense atmosphere. I want to hear the story untold. I've turned 18 today, Grandad. You promised you'd tell me the gun story when I turned 18. The old man was lost in thought. How about I tell you the sand dune story? Or about the time I was kidnapped by the sand pirates? Jake Devereaux hacked a cough, so painful sounding that Pete cringed. The old man discreetly peered into his handkerchief before shoving it into his dressing-gown pocket. But Pete had already caught a glimpse of the crimson specks on the monogrammed hanky. Those sprayed red blood dots reminded the young man of a painting set he had once received for Christmas. He blew through the end of the marker, and ink would spray from the business end to create colourful abstract shapes. But nothing was as shocking or striking as the blood-red blotches on Grandad's J.D. monogrammed handkerchief now. Channel. You've told me that sand pirate story 100 times. Petey, why don't you live a little and make it 101 times, I'd sure like to live a little when I have only a little to live. Another gasping wheeze. Pete shriveled inside every time the old man gasped for air with his open mouth, like the goldfish he had taken out of the bowl to study in the palm of his hand. It had always amazed the 18-year-old how the fish suffocated in the fresh air, dead air, yet breathed under water. He plopped the fish back into the bowl and washed its flapping gills with fascination. "Don't talk like that," Pete Devereaux considered his grandfather. "You know I don't like it when you talk like that." A second uncomfortable wave of silence came in the conversation. "Dying's a part of life, Petey." "I know that, but you have to remind me every time I visit. Living's a part of life too. I just don't want you to be surprised when you come around here someday and old shaky Jake won't be shaken anymore." And so the old man went into the story for the 101st time, how he and his team had survived behind a sand dune for 3 days straight. That Lebanese sand dune became their war trench, only to be taken hostage by black-toothed sand pirates for a full week before being rescued. As Jake spoke in his wheezy voice, the teenager gazed up at the case of military medals on the wall next to the pistol case. The bulb illuminating the glinting tokens of honor was on the brink, and it flickered. As the sun set that Friday evening, the blinking bulb became more noticeable as Pete listened to the old man's stories. That flashing bulb became the flash of artillery fire. Pete could feel the pounding pulse of the forever sun, the hot sand-blasting wind in his face, and the chop of the UV rays on his chapped lips. Screams of pain and whoops of glory. Out of respect, he didn't interrupt, but waited for his grandfather to finish the story, which never failed to keep him riveted. But today it was all about the story untold. A silence filled the room when the old man finished his story. Pete Devereaux's eyes wandered to the pistol in the lit case on the wall. "I want to know the story." "The last story," the old man reflected. Pete wasn't sure what his grandfather meant by this. "It's a very simple story, Pete. But it's not a story for a young man with everything to live for." "Grandad, I just want you to know that kids today know a lot more about life than kids did when you were my age. We've got something called the internet." "The what? The interned?" "No, the Jesus, Petey, I know what the internet is. I'm not an Egyptian mummy, despite appearances." "Grandad, I've seen shit on the internet that would make you sick." They shared a smile. That was one of the few old man's favourite one-liners when Pete asked him about the war. Jake Devereaux wanted to laugh, but gulped it down because he knew he wouldn't recover from a hard laugh. His lungs wouldn't take it. His bloodshot eyes raised to the pistol case. "That clock is the reason you're here, Petey." The old man's words didn't compute for Pete Devereaux. "What do you mean?" From behind the oxygen mask he answered, "You wouldn't exist if it weren't for that pistol." He paused. "Come to think of it, your father wouldn't exist either." Pete stared at the handheld gun. It stared back at him. "Grandad, I don't know. I wouldn't exist. I owe my life to that gun." Jake said this as if Pete should know by now what his grandfather was hinting at. "None of this would be happening if it weren't for that clock." An unexpected chill skittered across Pete Devereaux's flesh. This was no ordinary war story, if a war story could ever be considered normal. He had grown used to the pistol. Pete had grown up with that firearm. Every time he and his parents came around to his grandfather's place, the cold black metal thing would be watching over everything from that illuminated case. But now the young man felt insecure in the knowing that it knew more about him than he knew about it. He owed his life to that gun. His father owed his life to the same gun. His grandfather owed his life to the same gun. Why was the old man speaking in riddles now, when he had always spoken with brute honesty? "You said you owe your life to the gun. Did it save you in the war? Is that why you have it in that case?" "Yes, Pete. It saved my life." Pete Devereaux was standing now, unable to stay sitting. "You shot someone dead who was shooting at you?" Another pause. "Not exactly. So how did it save your life? The old man wheezed inside his oxygen mask. The gun jammed. Pete frowned. Wait, doesn't that mean it didn't work? Jake nodded slowly, his unblinking eyes on Pete now. Those watery peepers were trying to tell him something. So how did it save your life if it jammed? I dodged a bullet, boy. Whose bullet, Grandad? My bullet. Nothing was making sense. So let me get this right. Someone shot at you, but you dodged a bullet when your pistol jammed? It doesn't make sense. Or your pistol jammed when someone shot at you. So how did you dodge? I shot at myself. A deathly silence filled the living room. An invisible hand raised the volume on the oxygen machine, only it didn't have a volume button. And the gun jammed. Dodged a bullet. He gazed up at the case. It's still in the chamber. Pete's mouth opened to a wide O as his jaw dropped. He gawped at his grandfather before turning to the pistol in the case. You shot yourself? I wouldn't be here if I shot myself. Neither would you or your father. Pete's legs turned wobbly. He sat on the sofa next to his grandfather. I mean, you tried to shoot yourself. Sue. Pete couldn't bring himself to say the taboo word out loud. Suicide is the word I believe you're looking for. Pete gave a single solemn nod of his head. I did terrible things in the war, Petey. Stories you will never hear from me. Women and kids were fair game on the open battlefield. We were all just kids, easily swayed by an evil, corrupt, perverse government run by mentally challenged human beings. War is never the answer. Love is the answer, boy. I'm no hippie, but they got that right. Pause. Hitching breath. Their ghost came back to haunt me and persuaded me that I should be a ghost too. What right did I have to take their lives? You were in a war, Grandad. Does that make it right? The 18-year-old was about to answer. No. I want you to think about that, Petey. When is it ever right to take another life? Who has the right to take your life? Nobody. Nobody. Except yourself. Right? Pete wasn't sure how to respond. It was a loaded question. Pardon the pun. It wasn't something he'd thought about. Was it a trick question? He would go over these very words in just hours from now. On an unending loop, the 18-year-old would question the old man's reasoning. Was what he had done right or wrong? He didn't feel comfortable. Everything seemed strange. Pete Devereaux had been coming to this house since forever, but now everything looked alien to him. And the terminally ill man on the sofa looked only vaguely familiar behind that oxygen mask strapped around his head. Pete's heart began to race. He thought he was having a panic attack. At least, he figured he was. He'd never been in this situation. Petey, I tried to kill myself and the Glock jammed. Call it divine intervention, my guardian angel, or plain pot luck. That pistol saved my life and gave you life. Another goldfish gulp of air. That gun is a reason for living, Grandad. Yes, it is. That's why I have it up there, to remind me every day to appreciate what I have. That pistol gave me a lot more than what it would have taken away. And nobody. That's not true. Pete realized he was crying. You call that a nobody? He gestured to the case full of military medals. Who deserves a medal? You saved people's lives. Yes, I did. But I was also part of the war that created the havoc and destruction. I was only doing what was right, what any good human being would do. You think I need a medal of bravery for being human, for causing the same problems that I was saving people from? The 18-year-old didn't have an answer. Jake Devereaux twisted around and shoved his hand beneath his pillow. Just this movement alone was like a major mountain hike, and his grandfather hitched and spasmed to catch his wheezing breath. Pete could barely look. until the old man produced a key from beneath the pillow.
"Pete, open the case and pass me the gun."
Pete's grandfather had a strange look on his face. He slowly shook his head.
"Pete, the Glock."
"Why?"
"It's time."
"Time for what?"
"That gun jammed because it wasn't my time, Petey."
It was what he wasn't saying that gave Pete the creeps.
"Look at me. I'm suffering. It doesn't look good on me."
"You're suffering because you smoke. The people at the cigarette companies did this to you. You lived through a war, Grandad. You even tried to kill yourself, but you lived through that too. That gun is a celebration of life, Grandad. Don't you see that?"
"Let the Glock decide, boy. Hand it over."
The old man looked at the cold steel in Pete's hand with wide, ravenous eyes, and it didn't look like war hero Jake Devereaux anymore. He reminded Pete of Golem's obsessive desire for the ring. His head was reeling. The walls were coming in on top of him. This casual birthday meeting with his bedridden grandfather was unravelling into strange chaos. The old man twiddled his gnarled fingers.
"Give it here, boy. We have unfinished business. The greatest gift you can give me now, Petey, is a right to choose whether I want to play Russian roulette or not. Let the gun decide, Petey."
The 18-year-old stood up from the sofa and backed up to the doorway. "I'm going to put it back in the case, Grandad."
"No, Petey. Please. No."
There was desperation in the old man's voice, and Pete picked up on that. He realized his grandfather couldn't reach the case, too ill and time-warped to reach that far. The 18-year-old skirted around the sofa and reached up to place the pistol back in its case. The war veteran heaved and grunted as he made to leave the sofa, swinging his pale sticks-for-legs out from under the blanket. Slowly but surely, Jake Devereaux got to his feet and stood on the cold, tiled floor. He cut a sorry figure, standing there in his underpants and vest, scrawny limbs the colour of cheese, trembling chin. The lower eyelids had pulled away from his rheumy eyes in an aging process called ectropion. The most pathetic of all, he still held on to that fucking cancer stick between his yellowed fingers. The smoke curled around his face. Arms outstretched, face hidden behind the oxygen mask, he dragged his feet towards his grandson, holding the Glock in his jittering hand. And suddenly, the situation was out of control. One wrong move and the lad was going to fire off a round, the one bullet in the chamber with Jake's name on it. 4.5 decades had gone by, and the chances were that the pistol wouldn't fire, but old Jake knew about this. Hadn't he volunteered to locate undetonated grenades? Kept in the right conditions, weapons had no shelf life and could detonate tomorrow or 50 years from now, depending on storage. And speaking about shelf life, hadn't this Glock had a fine life on that shelf up there, enshrined in the case he'd made with his own hands all those years ago when that pistol had given him a second chance, and made up for what might very well have been a life-altering, there's an understatement, catastrophic mistake? The old man, only vaguely recognizable, came toward the young man. And in that moment of high strangeness, Pete Devereaux was looking at a living dead character in more than one way.
"Petey, hand it over,"
came his muffled voice. He hacked and wheezed, then coughed until he turned purple, then a sickly red hue, before dropping to a doughy pale. He slid toward Pete, stretching the oxygen-giving tube. "No! You're not thinking clearly, Grandad. Go back to bed. I'm calling Dad. You're going to break the oxygen line." He reached into his pocket for his phone. The old man cried out. It was more of a goat bleat than anything. "Petey!" He jolted toward the boy, but got his ankles caught up on the line from the mask to the buzzing ventilator and fell forward onto the floor, catching his temple on the coffee table, crying out on impact. The old man shunted and smacked onto the floor. Pete cried out as if he was the one who had fallen. He had never seen anything so helpless and disturbing in all his young life, watching his grandfather moan and groan in pain, caught up in his oxygen line, while blood poured from the opening in his head. And now the boy realized he was choking himself of oxygen. Jake had cut off his oxygen flow and was gasping for air. The more he flailed, the tighter he wrapped himself, until he was gasping for air. And now the machine was beeping, adding more hysteria.
But what sickened Pete to the next level was how the old man had protected his half-burned cigarette from the fall. It was still stuck between his brown-stained fingers. The old man had allowed his forehead to take the brunt of the fall on the coffee table, but made sure to keep his smoke lit, smokable and deadly. Why did he even need a velvet flare with an oxygen mask strapped to his face? It was perverse, and he was hooked on the nicotine that had reduced a hardened battle god to a pathetic, withered thing in crusty underwear. That wasn't so fucking velvety. Pete spasmed into action, placing the Glock carefully onto the coffee table, and began to unwind his grandfather from his oxygen line. As he unreeled the tube, he heard the oxygen hiss back into the line, and his grandfather took a deep gulp of oxygen, and a hint of pink rose in his cheeks. He looked up at him from the ground, dazed and confused. Pete took the cigarette from between his grandfather's fingers and turned to the kitchen sink to quench the smoking cigarette under the tap. And as he heard and watched the coffin nail singe under the cold water, Peter was seized by an icy numbness. As his instinct kicked in, prickling gooseflesh skittered along the nape of his neck and arms. His grandfather had gone very quiet behind his back. The 18-year-old froze, unable to turn around to face whatever had loomed up behind him. He could feel the old man in his up-close and personal space, right behind his back. The soft wheezing breaths made sure it wasn't just his imagination. Pete Devereaux summoned every fibre of his being to force himself to turn around, to face. The old man was standing there, the Glock pistol in his shaking right hand, cocked and ready to fire, if it was to fire, and not jam as it had done decades previous. For a second, Pete caught a glimpse of a younger version of his warring grandfather. It was the pose he struck. He held the pistol like a professional. The 18-year-old understood what it was to be on the wrong end of a pistol-wielding Jake Devereaux, and he was on the wrong end because the Glock was pointing right at him. "Grandad?" The old man pointed the business end of the pistol to the front door. "Go, Petey. I'm not going to leave you alone. I choose to be alone, Petey," Jake rasped. "I thank you for everything you've done for me. I've enjoyed our chats, and I hope we learned a little from each other." Wheezing gulp of air. "But this is my life, and this is my choice. Grant me that last wish, Petey. This pistol granted me a second life, and I'm eternally grateful. I don't want you to see this, but I'm going to pull this trigger whether you're here or not. I prefer you're not here when it happens, because you will have a lifetime of nightmares, as I have. Do you understand?" Pete began to cry. He was crying because he did understand. "You don't want to see me like this. I don't want to see me like this. This isn't how I roll, Petey. I've been through too much to fade out like this. I want to go out with a bang. Pardon the pun. This isn't how it was meant to be. It's time to take back what was given to me." Through the snot and tears, Pete Devereaux retorted, "You were given a precious second chance, but smoking has killed you. How could you be so stupid? You threw it away." "No, I didn't. I lived my life how I wanted to. I squandered it, yes, but you know what? I didn't throw it away." "Yes, you did." "No, lad, I did not. And do you know how I know that?" "How?" "You're here, Petey. You're the light at the end of this dark tunnel. You have made it worth it all, and I thank this Glock for giving you to me." The 18-year-old cried and made to hug the old man, but Jake shook his head solemnly and gestured to the front door. Desperate and confused, Pete nodded and vacated the living room, looking over his shoulder at the frail old man lifting the oxygen mask from his head, then leaning down to switch off the machine. An eerie silence filled the house as Pete left through the front door. Afraid to breathe, he closed it behind him and kept walking down the front garden path to the road. He had just latched his grandfather's gate when the crack of a gunshot split that Friday night in two, and split Pete Devereaux's life in two, before and after Jake Devereaux. 2. Sometimes the right objects make their way into the wrong hands, and other times the wrong objects make their way into the right hands. This would turn out to be Pete Devereaux's second dilemma. On Saturday afternoon, a post-mortem was carried out on Jake Devereaux's body to ensure no foul play was at hand and to verify his grandson's version of events. By Monday morning, Jake Devereaux's cadaver was stitched up and reposing in the local funeral home. On Tuesday, hundreds of mourners turned up to the war hero state funeral. Young Pete Devereaux realised just how important that frail old storyteller living on his sofa was without ever really knowing it. But he took umbrage at the same crowd of people, feeling that half the attendees, no, most of them, had no right to turn up to his grandfather's funeral when they had never come to visit him during the last year of his life when he got the terminal diagnosis, inoperable lung cancer. That was when Jake Devereaux really needed a friend. Or did he? No, not really. Old Shaky was just as happy in his sauce, as they say. On Friday morning, 1 week after Jake Devereaux clocked out early, clocked out right on time according to the old soldier, the family solicitor called the deceased's closest blood relatives to a reading of Jake's final will and testament. In hindsight, there wasn't any need to call anyone other than Pete, as his grandfather had left everything, the whole kit and caboodle, to him, and him only. Pete could just imagine his grandfather saying those words in his wheezy voice, could hear him. He stifled a smile at that expression coming from the lips of the dour solicitor, who briefly scowled at him from over his spectacles. That grin was the first time he had felt anything since the deafening gunshot had left him with a ringing in his ears and a paralysis of the mind. But that smile dropped away from the 18-year-old's face when Jake's posthumous words thanked Pete from beyond the grave for helping to release me of my burden. To everybody's dismay, including Pete, it turned out that the old man had signed his will and testament a year before the morbid dilemma that befell Pete Devereaux, telling him that his grandfather had planned the whole morbid show and didn't need to be prompted into remembering the promise he had made to young Pete years previous regarding the Glock's untold story to be told on his 18th birthday. Pete's father inquired about the date the document was made official. The solicitor informed Mr. Devereaux that his father's, Jake Devereaux's, will and testament was stamped with the law-binding stamp on the same date Jake Devereaux received his diagnosis. It was a symbolic act of death, and Pete had played an unwitting part in that macabre piece of theatre. Had the old man taken into account that Pete wouldn't comply so easily, surely tripping over his own oxygen line and opening his head on the corner of the coffee table hadn't been part of his master plan. Pete would never know. His grandfather had taken that to his grave, with a lot of other secret nuggets of wisdom. The old man specifically outlined the Glock pistol in his will and testament, and how it should stay in the family's hands, specifically in Pete Devereaux's hands, on the strict proviso that the 18-year-old would lock up the pistol in the case and never take it out again. "It has served its purpose," read the solicitor. No doubt this was another act in this strange theatre play. Besides, technically, the weapon was illegal. He didn't have a certificate or permit for the pistol. Pete wasn't sure how to react to that statement. He felt his mother and father's eyes on him, gauging his thoughts. Having the same Glock that saved and killed his grandfather on show was, well, a tad macabre, for want of a better word. At the time of the solicitors' meeting in the town square, the Glock was in the possession of the police, who conducted a few mandatory tests on the weapon following terminally ill Jake Devereaux's suicide, just to make sure Pete Devereaux's story was checking out, and he wasn't hiding a dark secret. But everything, including the autopsy, checked out. There was no smoking gun, except the one in Jake Devereaux's living room. And speaking of Jake Devereaux, a.k.a. Shaky Jake, a term he coined for himself, checking out early, Pete's parents weren't all that fond of the idea of their son having a gun in his possession, never mind the same gun that ended his grandfather's life. But he was 18, and legally an adult. Yes, on paper their only son was an adult, but they were also aware that their son was of a fragile nature, and possessed a giddy disposition. Mr. and Mrs. Devereaux made Pete swear to them, on his dead grandfather's grave no less, that he would lock up that pistol, just as the old man had wished, but here's where they deviated from the will. They demanded that Pete give them the key, and they would look after it. Pete did one better, and flung it in the local river. But the 18-year-old held very tightly onto the front door key of the little bungalow he was handed down. And it wasn't long after the old man's dramatic exit when Pete began to stay over at night. It had started only a fortnight after the burial, half an hour here, an hour there, in the evenings. Before the young man knew it, he was sitting where the old man spent most of his last year, on the sofa. He felt closer to Jake. He was everywhere and nowhere in the bungalow, and it was a surreal feeling. What was he looking for? Nothing. He just wanted to grab back a little of what he'd felt while listening to the old man's war stories about sand pirates and... But he was looking for something, and the 18-year-old couldn't deny that. Maybe he was looking for answers as to why Shaky Jake would end it so tragically after all he'd been through. But hadn't he already answered that question without giving the answer? His will and testament made it clear that he'd orchestrated the whole thing. He'd taken the jammed Glock as a second chance at life. But that same pistol would decide his fate again years later, and it did, by lodging a bullet in Jake Devereaux's temporal lobe. Maybe Pete wanted to turn back the clock and give the old man the Glock without having that horrible image of his grandfather flailing and bleating on the floor, wrapped up in his own oxygen line. Yes, it was a metaphor. And yes, that ghastly image was a memory fire-branded into his psyche. His parents expressed their reservations about this strange arrangement, but Pete was the rightful owner of the house, and his father supported him, even helping him fix up a few things to make the place look more sprightly. Sprightly was the word his mother used. They gave the place a lick of paint and fixed the guttering. They told Pete that it would be better if they dumped the sofa where his grandfather once lay, but he point-blank refused and insisted that the sofa stay where it was, at least for now. He wasn't ready to say goodbye just yet. It was on one of these fix-it-up days when Pete turned to his father and said, quite out of the blue, "You know, it was the smoking that killed him, not the gun." His father wasn't sure how to react. He wouldn't have killed himself if he didn't have the cancer. "How do you know?" "I just know." "We'll never know that, Pete." "Why would he? He could have lived another 10 or 15 happy years. But the cigarettes robbed him of that, Dad. After all he went through, dodging bullets in Lebanon." "Ironic,"
came his father's muted response.
"Pete, we'll never know why he did it the way he did it, and it's best if you just accept it, because there's no way to turn back the clock."
Pete turned to his father, paintbrush in hand. "You didn't like him very much, did you?" Mr. Devereaux paused for thought.
"He was my father, but never my dad, if you catch my drift."
Pete considered his father's wise words. He did catch his drift, and he was grateful for his relationship with his father. Even if it wasn't the closest relationship, they still got on. They were very different, but had learned to coexist. As the evenings went by, Pete became convinced that there was something the old soldier wanted him to take care of. He wasn't at the bungalow to find answers. He was there to find orders, like any good soldier. There was a loose end to this theatre play. The third act was missing. The real reason for lingering at the bungalow would come to Pete Devereaux, and it would come to him in a dream of all places. And speaking of that third act... 3. That night Jake Devereaux came to Pete in a dream and sat down on his old death sofa, as opposed to deathbed, and told the young man what he had to do, how he had to do it, when he had to do it, and most importantly of all, what he needed to take with him. Jake told him that thousands would thank him for his service, just like a great soldier. All they needed was one to show them the way. Then they too would rise against the machine. The dream was so real. It was so real because it was real. His grandfather's ghost had come to him one last time to relay this information. He was a culmination of a few factors, like Pete's conversation with his father and how he was convinced his grandfather ended his life because smoking had ended it first. Then, lying in his grandfather's shrine, Pete had done some mindless scrolling on smoking and why it wasn't banned. He discovered that smoking was the leading cause of costly illness and disease and was fueling the soaring healthcare costs.
There were also black market concerns, with tobacco producers maintaining that more harmful substances would come onto the market and illegal sales would skyrocket. It was all bullshit, and just a weak excuse to continue legally killing people, as far as he was concerned. More harmful substances? Really? What could be more harmful than watching your grandfather spray crimson ink onto his handkerchief? No, wait. It wasn't ink. It was warm blood. The old man had coughed up from his smoke-scarred lungs. It wasn't long before the mindless scrolling became online sleuthing, before he'd fallen asleep and discovered that a major tobacco business convention was happening in this city, and all the heads of the biggest cigarette companies would be present. It was a sign from the old man. No, it wasn't a sign, because he had come to him in his dream and given him his orders. He fell asleep with all this information swirling around in his head like a tornado of cigarette smoke, fogging his senses. In the middle of the night he woke to see his grandfather sitting there next to him, telling him what he already soaked up as he drifted off to sleep. The following morning, Pete Devereaux skipped school and went down to the river instead. Around the same time Pete Devereaux was ascending the steps from the river to the road, the principal of the local high school was on the phone with Pete's mother, asking her if Pete was ready to return to school. When Mrs. Devereaux asked what the principal had meant by that, the school director first took this as his opportunity to offer his condolences, and added that he understood Pete was very close to his grandfather. But a few weeks had gone by, and there was no sign of Pete. Of course, he was under no obligation as he was 18 years old, the principal explained, and compulsory education was no longer the law after 16. But still, a heads-up would be nice. Mrs. Devereaux expressed her shock and assured the school director that she would have a word with Pete and get to the bottom of it. She was quick to add that she worked as a dental hygienist at the local dentistry and normally left the house before Pete did. The same could be said for her husband, a tractor mechanic who owned his own business. Even as she was on the line, Mrs. Devereaux realized she hadn't seen her son getting ready for school since her father-in-law passed on. It was true that sometimes, no, a lot of times, he was running late and would only appear as she was leaving for work. Something wasn't right with him. She had become complacent and felt guilty about that. Not that she said any of this to the school principal. Mrs. Devereaux needed to spend more time with her son and reconnect. But by the time she would have her little chat with her struggling son, it would be too late, and he would have already left to take out his grandfather's orders. Pete Devereaux got back to the bungalow. Every time he stepped into the living room, he expected to see the old man lying on the sofa. It seemed that no matter how many times he walked in and out of the house, he could sense his grandfather's spirit envelop him. Just because he wasn't here didn't mean he wasn't here. Jake Devereaux was in the house, and all Pete had to do was channel him in through the right frequency. He could see him sitting on the sofa, plopped there in that indentation in the right cushion by the little table where he liked to place his coffee mugs. To anyone else, it was just a hollow in an old sofa where someone had sat a lot. But Pete could see the old man sitting there, staring at him in pensive silence. "Yes," Pete answered. "I did what you told me, Grandad. Look," he declared, and held up the key to the sofa. "I thought I'd lost it in the river, but I just couldn't feel it in the water because my fingers were too numb with the cold." He laughed a tad too hysterically. Pete hadn't exactly flung the key into the river, but had more carefully placed the key in a shallow pocket of water by the steps leading down to the riverbank. Pete knew the river like the back of his hand, having fished off the riverbank many times. He just couldn't bring himself to get rid of it completely. Not yet. So had told a white lie to his parents. He didn't want them worrying. Pete had fished the key out of the icy water and pocketed in his anorak, ascended the stone steps and took a right toward the bungalow instead of a left for school. The wind picked up and blew in his face as he raced along. There was silence except for the ticking of the German cuckoo clock on the wall above the fireplace, which Pete dutifully wound on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, just as Jake had done before him. He enjoyed when the cuckoo popped out to chime, followed by the little hand-carved figurines dancing to Edelweiss. That was one of the few times the old man truly smiled, listening to that magical tune coming from the Black Forest time box, nodding along and ba-ba-ba-bum-bumming along, while wiggling his forefingers like a music conductor with two batons. The clock struck 10 o'clock, and the clock went through the motions, the cone weights dropping, chains rising as it gonged 10 bells, followed by the nodding cuckoo, and with every cuckoo, cuckoo, young Devereaux would imitate the cuckoo. Cuckoo, yes. And finally the Edelweiss dancers took the stage, and Pete danced about the living room, holding the slightly rusty key aloft, pirouetting about the place and laughing his head off, and giving it the old bop-a-bop-bombing. The cuckoo and dancers disappeared inside their sprung doors, and Pete went to the case on the wall, and the Glock looking back at him from behind the glass. He briefly considered the case next to it, the one with the medals of bravery, then stood to attention and snapped a military salute to the medal case, giggling as he did so. He turned back to the pistol case and inserted the key into the lock. Pete noted how the light rusting from the river grated as the key slipped through the cylinder mechanism of the lock. The 18-year-old clicked open the case, then carefully lifted the pistol from its stand. He placed it on the same coffee table the old man had fallen against, then closed the case. He sat on the sofa, next to the familiar dip in the cushion, and stared at the Glock. The wind had really gotten up by now, and it whistled through the window by the telly. Pete made a mental note to repair it with his dad's help. As the wind whistled, Pete began to make out an odd series of familiar sounds, rises and dips. And before he knew it, whispering was coming in on the same frequency, only privy to Pete Devereaux. "In the chamber," came that whistling whisper from the old man's cold lips. Pete stood up and went to the pistol case. Tucked into the corner, not visible unless one was searching, was a small, time-faded bullet box. Pete had always known it was there, but had never asked about it because it never entered the equation. He opened the box to discover a single glinting bullet, and knew exactly what he had to do because Grandad had whispered it through the window. He picked up the pistol and sat next to the hollow in the sofa. With his grandfather guiding his hands, he clicked out the magazine and popped that bullet in, then clicked it back into the stock with a nudge from the heel of his hand, then racked the pistol. Being an enthusiast of action films really helped. The gradual and unconscious absorption of watching weapons being loaded on TV had seeped into Pete Devereaux. It was something called osmosis. Watch or listen to enough of something and one becomes an expert without ever knowing it. But that wasn't the case here, because Pete could feel the old man's cold hand guiding his, like a puppet master pulling his puppet's strings. "One in the chamber, Grandad?" Pete listened to the wind howling through the cracked window, but an answer didn't come back. Just turbulence. He wasn't tuned in correctly, that was it. He stood and turned to the medals, saluting for a second time, snapping his right hand to his forehead, then bowed as if suddenly changing from the military to a Japanese bow of respect. That simple bow might have been the giveaway to any psychologist witnessing Pete Devereaux's mental breakdown. They might have noted how meticulous the young man was until the random Japanese bow, which had no meaning or purpose in Pete Devereaux's world. It was an insight into the flaring disarray in his mind, the growing confusion and separation from the self. It was a telltale sign of the 18-year-old's descent into psychosis. That simple throwaway Japanese bow, probably picked up from the TV like everything else, was an indicator into Pete's slipping into an alternate reality where he lived in the frequency. But all of that was bullshit, because there were no one-way mirrors or hidden cameras on the walls of Jake Devereaux's living room. Just a cuckoo clock. Yes, cuckoo. There was nobody to save Pete Devereaux from himself, only himself. And maybe fate. "Permission to leave, sir?" Pete asked the sofa. The cuckoo uttered a single cuckoo to mark 10:30 a.m. Pete Devereaux took that as a yes. He left the bungalow with the Glock in his back pocket and made for the bus stop on the outskirts of town. There he got a bus to the city. During the bus ride, he checked Google once again to make sure everything was going according to plan, where the Tobacco Business Conference was taking place and who was slated to speak. A major cigarette company CEO was keynote speaker, due to take to the stage at 1 p.m. that afternoon. 45 minutes later, 18-year-old Pete Devereaux arrived in the city with nothing in his front pocket but his empty wallet and a loaded Glock pistol in his back pocket. The wind howled through the streets as Pete made his way to the city centre, following the GPS coordinates on his phone to the five-star hotel in the business district of the city. He had chosen to overlook the numerous missed calls and text messages from his parents. They wanted to know where he was, and he would tell them in good time. He probably wouldn't have to tell them. They'd see him on the 6 o'clock news. 15 minutes after midday, the 18-year-old arrived outside the hotel. He waited around, watching business people come and go from the hotel. At 10 minutes to 1 o'clock, a chauffeur-driven black-tinted Mercedes people carrier pulled up outside the hotel. 4 people got out of the back of the plush van. Pete instantly recognized the last individual as the CEO of Velvet Flare, Jack Long, a man in his early 60s and who was, Pete noticed, in great shape. He didn't have pockmarked yellowing vellum skin like his grandfather did. He didn't look like a warmed-up corpse. Long had put Grandad in an early grave after everything he'd been through. A national hero reduced to an oxygen-masked, pathetic creature in stale, yellowed undies, who couldn't laugh anymore because he was going to spit up a chunk of lung. And charging for all of this? And guess what? He didn't know Grandad. How could... It all happened in a dizzying flurry. Seized by a fit of rage, Pete Devereaux reached into his back pocket and felt the reassuring cold steel. Pete didn't care about anything anymore. He was serving his country, taking out his grandfather's orders. The others would follow and rise against the machine. Grandad told him so. Nobody noticed the kid appear from behind the black Mercedes, holding up what appeared to be an old Glock at arm's length in CEO Jack Long's direction. "One in the chamber," Pete whispered into the wind as he picked a point on the man's back where he figured Long's lungs were. Raised the pistol, then pulled the trigger. He squeezed his eyes shut momentarily, waiting for the same ear-ringing, thunderous crack he had heard from outside the bungalow on that fateful Friday evening. A lot of things went through Pete Devereaux's mind as he squeezed the trigger. A sinking, scrotum-shrinking wriggled through him when he knew it was too late to ease his finger back. It was as if it had taken the rising of the Glock to realize what he was about to do. Lifting the pistol and aiming was a catharsis in itself, ridding himself of the demons left behind in Grandad's wake. A WTF moment for sure. Besides, hadn't Pete's grandfather told him never to shoot a man in the back in the art of battle? Look him in the eyes and let him know you're taking his life. If not, his ghost will roam the battlefield forever, wandering where everybody had gone. A soft click sounded in the Glock instead of that ear-splitting crack. Pete Devereaux opened his right eye, then the left, just in time to see Long walking into the building with his entourage. He forgot to breathe as he stared at the Glock on the end of a trembling arm that didn't feel like his own arm, but the arm of a movie villain. He heard the old man's words come in on the wind. "Let the gun decide, Petey." The Glock had jammed. The Glock had decided. Fate had intervened, and nobody fucks around with fate. Pete came to his senses and looked about to see if anyone had seen him. All eyes were on silent killer Jack Long, CEO of Velvet Flare. Nobody saw the silent wannabe killer gunman. Pete felt like a fool in a black comedy, or a nincompoop, as Grandad might say. Or else he felt like the wisest and luckiest kid in the world in that Glock jam second. He wasn't sure yet. The pistol had taught him a priceless lesson. Of that much, he was sure. Sweating and palpitating, Pete Devereaux slipped the vintage Glock into his anorak pocket and stepped away from the scene of carnage that never was. Halfway up the street, he thought he was going to pass out as his legs turned all rubbery on him. An hour later, he was back on the bus home, hoping to Christ and all above that nobody had picked him out of the crowd. That was something that was going to haunt him for the coming hours, days, weeks, months, and by the time years came around, he would still think about it. Cold cases were solved decades after the crime was committed, but no crime was committed. Or was there? An intended crime was committed. That doubt would hang over him, would try to hang him, and it would be Pete Devereaux's penance. On the way back to his house, Pete stopped at the river and flung the key far into the middle of the deepest current where he would never find it again. But as the glinting key whirled through the air, Pete realized there was no point in ridding himself of it when he had the damn pistol in his anorak pocket. The decision took a fraction of a second to cross the synapses of his brain and sail across the river as Pete caught the Glock and launched it high and far, watching it with relish spin through the air and plop into the deep river, right by the blackthorn tree growing from the river bank. Like his grandfather, the pistol was gone forever. So it was a relief to know exactly where the Glock was on the riverbed, should he ever need it, stuck in the roots of the old blackthorn.